Before I get too far into this video, I just want to say that I have a Spyro 1 video up as well, so if you want to go look at that, I'll link it in the description. There's this weird and unique thing that happens in gaming sometimes. If some games in a series have remakes or remasters, but others don't, this wild thing can happen where you're moving forward in a franchise, Spyro 1 to 2 to 3, but certain mechanical aspects that were changed or modernized in the updated versions of the earlier entries just didn't exist yet in the original releases of those later entries. I played the Reignited version of Spyro 1, and it was great, but I had a mountain of issues with the Reignited version of Spyro 2 that I will get to in like the entire second half of this video. So on that note, I'm Kalice, and I recommend the original version of Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage, also called Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer, and very much do not recommend the Reignited version of Spyro 2. To get our dragon tale started, Spyro is chilling in the world of dragons. It's raining, he's pretty bummed out about it. Apparently it's been raining for a while. I actually quite like the rain, unless I actually have to go outside on it. Glasses. So he decides that he and Sparks will go on vacation to Dragon Shores, a place that's much more sunny. There's also some references to the first game in this conversation, which is pretty cute. Spyro jumps into the portal to Dragon Shores, then the scene transitions to a world we've never seen before called Avalar. Here we see three new characters having a discussion around a portal: Elora, Hunter, and the Professor. Truly imaginative name, that one. They are talking about what they're going to do about Ripto, who is apparently a problem, and it seems like the current plan is to get a dragon to help. Shortly after, Spyro shoots out of the portal to a place that is definitely not Dragon Shores. Before these new characters can finish making nice with Spyro, a fireball flies in from off screen and destroys the portal. Enter Ripto, and his minions Crush and Gulp. Ripto's very not happy to see a dragon here.
Were you trying to keep something from me? A dragon? You brought a dragon to Avalar? I hate dragons! Gah!
A fairy, Zoe, whispers to Elora, then heads over to mess with Ripto and his goons. Saturday morning cartoon shenanigans ensue, culminating with Gulp eating Ripto's scepter. There's no time to explain, so Elora gives Spyro a guidebook. This is actually a mechanically relevant thing, kind of, so that's neat, and heads off. After the first level of sweet, sweet mascot platforming, Elora greets Spyro as he enters the hub area of Summer Forest, and finally gives a proper introduction to herself. In order to beat Ripto and actually get to Dragon Shores, Spyro will need to collect talismans from all around Avalar, and wouldn't you know it, Spyro already got one from finishing that first level. Elora also comments that orbs are important to collect, but she'll explain why later, and Spyro sets out on his journey to defeat Ripto. This time around, there are actually a number of cutscenes throughout the game that give a bit more context to what's going on. They'll eventually explain what orbs are, how Ripto arrived in and took over Avalar, and just provide context for what we're doing, usually right before a boss level or right after you beat a boss. It's nice to have a bit more of a direct story. It's not a particularly complex one. Ripto's a bad dude doing bad things. Spyro wants to get on with his vacation and is also like a good bean and wants to help. It's simple, it's fun, and literally every single character is great, with one exception that I'll get to much later. Play the levels, beat the baddies, and collect tons of stuff. What more could you want? The moment-to-moment story and world building is much better this time around. Elora, Hunter, and the Professor appear in various worlds and have tasks that you can assist them with that, of course, give collectibles. Elora's nice and cheery most of the time, but she does have a bit of a bite to her.
I'm a fawn, you dork.
Oh, sorry.
She's absolutely great and expressive and adorable, and I love her. Hunter is the textbook definition of a himbo, a lovable dummy with his heart in the right place. The Professor might have an ethics problem, I'm not sure. I feel as if he's the weakest of the core cast just because he didn't seem to have much more going on than science. It's fine, he's still likable, just not particularly unique as far as I'm concerned. It's also nice to see our big bad final boss actually interacting with and ordering around the other bosses. Ripto's even there in the boss arenas taunting Spyro during your battles against the other two. It really does make it feel like an escalation of scale and threat as you work your way towards that inevitable confrontation with Ripto. Individual levels also have better writing and world building. Each level has a race of people that live there that gives Spyro a specific task that always involves in one way or another reaching the end of the level, with a talisman as a reward. These small stories, along with brief, comedic, slapsticky intro and outro videos, do a lot to contextualize what you're doing in each level and made me feel like I was actually making an impact on the places I was visiting. I very much enjoyed the first game, but you were always doing the same thing in every level. Saving dragons, collecting stuff. In Spyro 2, you're still absolutely always collecting stuff. It is a collectathon, but sometimes you'll be discovering why a fountain is turned off, or escorting baby turtles, they're invincible. Don't worry about either the concept of baby turtles dying, or having to do a terrible escort mission, or freeing satyrs that have been encased in stone. It keeps things interesting and provides even more of that wonderful cartoony flavor. Each level also has a sister level that's narratively related in some way, usually with similar-ish types of NPCs. For example, there are male fawns in Magma Cone and female fawns in Fracture Hills, and a prominent enemy type in both of those levels are Earthshakers. It makes the world feel connected in a more direct way, rather than just being tied together by a sort of loose theme. These connections replace the theming of each set of levels from the original game. There are still hub levels, these ones based on seasons, but the levels that you go to from those hubs don't all strictly follow that seasonal theme, which allows each level to feel more individualistic while still connecting to other parts of Avalar. I like it a lot. Even more so than the first game, I felt like I was playing a cartoon. The tone draws heavy inspiration both from comedic, slapsticky cartoons and Saturday morning action cartoons. Moment to moment, the comedic aspect is more apparent. Enemy animations, especially their death animations, just have that cartoony energy to them. The intro and outro of each level very often comedically and rather violently present the problem of each level or show that it was at least somewhat resolved at the end. Most of the dialogue is lighthearted or goofy, and anything that's remotely dark is played for laughs rather than taken seriously. Ripto provides our Saturday morning cartoon vibe. He very much reminded me of Ludo from Star vs. the Forces of Evil, which I suppose is like saying Gundam reminded me of Code Geass. Time is weird. At any rate, I can't help but picture Ripto angrily shaking his fist at the sky after being foiled yet again. He definitely can be menacing, but again, the whole game's tone is pretty light, so it's not surprising that he's closer to Skeletor than the Gravemind. The basics of the gameplay very much carry over from the first Spyro game. You can jump, of course. Hitting the jump button again in the air causes Spyro to glide. You can control his direction as he slowly gets closer to the ground. This is still absolutely essential to getting around pretty much every level in the game. This time, there's an addition to Spyro's platforming moveset. At the end of a glide, you can hit the triangle button to do a cute little flutter that gives you an extra bit of height, but cancels your glide. This makes the platforming just the slightest bit more complex. It greatly limits one of the minor annoyances in the first game. Sometimes if you didn't jump just right, you'd wind up needing to do the jump again because you hit the ledge instead of landing on the platform. This eliminates that problem most of the time, while also allowing for slightly more difficult jumps from time to time. I actually did run into a problem with the mechanic early on based on a bad habit that I had picked up from playing other games with the glide. The jump button is X, and the little wing flappy button is triangle. I got it in my head that I needed to hold the X button to continue the glide while simultaneously pressing the triangle button to get that extra bit of vertical air, which is not particularly easy to do. Actually, you just need to press the jump button a second time to begin your glide. The game says this repeatedly early on, but I had held it for the entirety of the first game and do for most other games that have a glide. This caused me to fly into walls repeatedly, which meant I couldn't do the little flap. To be clear, I'm not holding that against the game. It was absolutely my fault, and it made me feel super dumb when I figured out why I was having control issues. But just keep it in mind if you played other games with gliding and might run into the same problem. May my humiliation serve as an example so you don't have to suffer the same. Once I corrected my issue, I found it to be just as fun and satisfying as the rest of the platforming. One movement option was actually taken away. Spyro can no longer roll. While it was cute to see him roll around in the first game, it wasn't ever a particularly useful skill, so I am completely fine with that having been removed. The game shows its age most in its camera controls. Unfortunately, you cannot use the right stick to control the camera. Instead, you have to use the shoulder buttons to turn it. This is the only game I can remember playing that has camera controls like this, and it definitely took a while to adjust to. There's a setting you can toggle so the camera will orient itself properly based on the direction that Spyro moves in, and then you can just kind of adjust it when need be, which did a lot to alleviate the problems I had adjusting. By the end of the game, I was fine with the controls, but camera controls being tied to the right stick definitely would have been preferable. Spyro's options for dealing with enemies are initially unchanged. His Fire Breath and Charge return. Fire Breath being a brief little damage cone in front of our cute purple boy, and the Charge being a rapid dash in a direction you control. But that control is somewhat more difficult than controlling normal movement, so be sure to control your controls in a controlled manner, or you just might send Spyro careening into a wall. Painfully. It doesn't actually deal damage. Spyro can also stop and look around, which can be used to fire certain things out of his mouth at like a specific target, or aim a super flame shot at a specific target. Sparks the Dragonfly protects his friend from harm on this adventure once again. He functions as a health indicator, changing colors as you take damage. After you've taken 3 hits, he disappears, which means you're only 1 more hit away from a lost life. I actually lost far fewer lives than in the first game, mainly because Treetops isn't a level in this game, and also because there are just far fewer bottomless pits in general. Aside from that, the game is a bit harder. Enemies are just more competent in general, up to and including bosses, but I still came nowhere near to running into problems with lives. There is unfortunately not a cheat code to give more lives, but running out of lives apparently just knocks you out of whatever level you were in to the related hub area, which doesn't strike me as a particularly big deal. Burning small innocent animals spawns a butterfly that Sparks can eat to regain a hit point. If Sparks is gone, he'll fly back on screen to eat a butterfly, and then he'll be back. Burning them also rarely gives an extra life. So yeah, I still feel bad that I have to murder these cute critters to regain health. Time has not desensitized me at all, and if anything, the wider variety of cuddly creatures has made it even more traumatizing. Thanks, Insomniac. Spyro 2 is definitely a collectathon, just like the original, so again, if that's not something that's appealing to you, this game probably won't do anything to change your mind. It's wonderful fun, but it's very well within its genre boundaries. I think a lot is done to make the different types of collectibles feel worthwhile in different ways, which as far as I'm concerned makes them more satisfying to collect. Gems are the primary returning collectible. They're still scattered all over the level in various breakable chests and pottery. Enemies don't drop them in this entry though. Killing them serves a different purpose that we'll get to later. Sparks can also point at the nearest gem that you haven't collected. Again, I personally avoided using this until I had already looked over the level at least once, but you do you. An NPC named Moneybags so helpfully offers to relieve Spyro of his hard-earned cash, and in exchange he allows Spyro to progress in some way, usually by like lowering a bridge or something like that. He also occasionally teaches Spyro a new ability. Moneybags is absolutely completely against Ripto and wants him gone, but what kind of capitalist would he be if he didn't profit off of every possible opportunity? Moneybags, you represent everything I despise about capitalism, but are an exceptionally well-written character. I read his character as a criticism of capitalism, or at the very least of the rich corporate types, and I'm always here for that. Also, every single line of his dialogue is infuriatingly hilarious. I absolutely recommend saying no to him at every transaction before actually giving him the gems, because each and every instance of Moneybags extorting you for cash has a unique line of rejection dialogue. Almost all of these transactions are required to progress. Most notably of these are the ones where Moneybags teaches you a new ability. I don't know how exactly he teaches a dragon how to do these things, or why Spyro couldn't just like ask Alora or Hunter, but sure, fine, whatever, game mechanics. Two of these abilities provide new traversal options for Spyro, and the third is an attack. All of them are pretty simple, but solid additions to Spyro's moveset. Swimming allows Spyro to swim. Shocking, I know. It actually feels pretty good. Movement functions rather differently underwater. To actually start swimming, you press the charge button to go underwater, then your movement changes Spyro's orientation. How progressive. The jump button is a slow acceleration, the charge button is a fast acceleration. If you're charging, you can kill enemies. Fire doesn't work underwater because of course it doesn't. Also, you can stay underwater for as long as you like. No popping back up to the surface every couple of seconds or chasing an air bubble as the music comes close to causing a panic attack. It's a nice change of pace, and I don't think it's overutilized. The other two are a bit simpler, but still solid additions. Climbing lets Spyro stick his claws into the wall and climb up certain points. There are a handful of platforming sections with this, and it actually very much reminds me of climbing in Uncharted or Assassin's Creed. Feels good in those, feels good in this. The final ability is a head bash. If you hit the button you normally use to do the little flutter while not gliding but just jumping, Spyro will do a headfirst ground pound downward. It feels pretty good to use, but it's pretty underutilized. There's a few obstacles to destroy and enemy types that take advantage of it, but everything that does use it is fairly simplistic, whereas pretty much every other mechanic has unique, innovative stuff going on, often combining aspects of multiple mechanics to create something new. It is fine, but the rest of the game is more than just fine. Talismans are given to you for completing each level in the first two hub areas. They're pretty simple, basically they just exist as progression blockers, but they're meant to act as a sign that you're actually helping people out and doing the hero thing. It's usually heroic. I think there might actually be one instance where I could go all game theory and accuse Spyro of war profiteering, but that would be arguing in bad faith. And also dumb. Orbs are probably the most interesting collectible. They don't become relevant in terms of unlocking things until late game. A few of them can be found in hard to reach areas, but most come from completing missions given to you by NPCs. Many of these introduce new, simple mechanics or ask you to do something different with existing mechanics. Others are full-on minigames. I had an absolute blast with these. They're inventive and fun, and they keep the gameplay varied and interesting. Some of them are rather simple, but even the simplest ones are absolutely brimming with character and charm. Listen to me. This is important. When George the Snow Leopard became my friend, I genuinely almost started to cry because of how cute he is. The simple animation of him plopping onto the ground is one of the most endearing things I have ever seen in my life. George is the best. My favorite minigames were hockey, which I had way too much fun with. Oh my gosh, this is a game where I enjoy the swimming and the ice physics? What the heck is happening? And the parasailing minigame.
Which is weird, because a lot of people look at those and be like, these are the ones that aren't the best.
Really?
Yeah.
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 Interesting.
Yeah. I'm really glad you liked them. I'm glad you liked the video.
Yeah, it was great. The only orb in the whole game that I had trouble getting to the point that I was no longer having fun was the one where you have to chase down some robotic bugs. They are robots, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That very well could have just been a lack of skill on my part, though.
No, it's fairly hard.
Speaking of skill, this is the first game that actually properly introduced skill points instead of tacking them on after the fact like the Reignited version of 1. Crazily enough, they're actually more fun and rewarding in Spyro 2. They very much entail the same sort of things, beating bosses without getting hit, burning certain things in the environment, and also doing perfectly on certain minigames, plus a few other odds and ends. The ones that involve interacting in some way with objects and levels actually feel like they're laid out in a natural and fun way, as opposed to being annoying or otherwise awkward to track down. Also, each skill point you unlock adds an additional page to the epilogue that you unlock after beating the final boss. It's really cute and makes completing all of these challenges feel rather worthwhile. The hub levels are similar to how they were in the first game. There are collectibles to track down and portals scattered around all of the other levels. There are 3 hub worlds this time, each one based on a season, no spring-based one for some reason. Maybe it got cut during development, I don't know. The one notable change, aside from our friendly NPCs being about, is that there are no enemies present. It's actually kind of strange, considering the fact that Ripto supposedly subjugated Avalar. Still, it provides a nice and regularly occurring change of pace from the more standard levels. Those standard levels are much more varied in their themes than in the first game. Like I said before, it's more about tying 2 levels together in some way, rather than making all of the levels connected to a hub area fit together thematically. In addition to those direct connections, there are occasionally small nods to other existing levels. For a game in which you're going through portals to completely disparate locations, it did a lot to make the world feel like a connected and whole place, and moreover allowed each level to be about pretty much anything without it feeling out of place. My favorites are Robotica Farms and Metropolis, which very much has to do with their theming. I am a sucker for sci-fi, especially in a context that it doesn't normally show up in, or when combined with another genre like fantasy. This game has a dragon talking to to a robot, and it doesn't feel at all out of place. Absolutely amazing. Levels still very much have wide open areas that take advantage of Spyro's ability to glide, while also having numerous branching paths to explore. Exploration is even more rewarding this time, as in addition to getting all those glorious collectibles, you're also coming across unique situations with NPCs who need your help in a variety of ways. Variety really was one of the defining features of this experience for me. I constantly felt like I was exploring new places, doing new things, and dealing with new enemies. Those enemies very much follow the same core mechanical principles as the first game. Spyro has his flame and his charge, armored enemies cannot be flamed, giant enemies cannot be charged. Each level has unique enemies either in how they act, how they look, or how they have to be dealt with, or any combination of all of those. Generally speaking, enemies are more challenging than in the first game. Playing aggressively will still very often serve you well, but many enemies stay safely out of Spyro's range until they attack, which means you have to deal with that attack before you respond, while others simply attack so quickly that you have to react to that before burning them to ashes, assuming you want to avoid getting hit, that is. There's even an enemy that explodes upon death. Enemy animations are still absolutely delightful to see, and I'm especially fond of when enemies are interacting with each other in the environment. My favorite example is these flying birds that toss ammo down to other birds on the ground that then shoot them at you. Once you've dealt with all the birds on the ground, the flying birds change to flying down to throw the ammo themselves, which of course puts them into the range of Spyro's flames. It's a perfect combination of flavor, variety in gameplay, and even a bit of puzzle solving. Not all of the examples in the game are as robust as this, but it does highlight the design philosophy Insomniac took to the variety of baddies the game throws at you. You're constantly dealing with something new and unique. I mentioned before that enemies don't drop gems upon their first death like in the first game. This time, each enemy you kill drops like spirit particles that contribute to a total for the level. Scattered around each level are these weird gate things with numbers floating above them. Once you get enough spirit particles, these gates will activate and provide a new temporary power-up of some kind to Spyro that will allow you to collect more collectibles, reach new areas, and complete some of those side objectives for orbs. The simplest of these is a spring that launches Spyro upward. Some of the gates enable flight, allowing Spyro to move vertically while gliding. There's an ice breath power-up that replaces Spyro's normal fire breath and allows you to freeze and then platform on enemies. The Supercharge and Super Flame return through this new mechanic. Supercharging functions pretty much identically. Spyro moves much faster then and is harder to control than during a normal charge. And this allows some obstacles to be destroyed, and it ignores almost all enemy immunities, with one notable exception in Fracture Hills, where those enemies act as obstacles in a supercharged section. The Super Flame is actually rather different this time. It still ignores enemy immunities and can be used to destroy otherwise immune chests and obstacles, but instead of being like Spyro's normal flame breath, it's a fireball that flies much further and can be aimed vertically if you use Spyro's looking around mode thing. Also, it works underwater because magic. I'll fully admit that I miss getting kissed by cute fairies to activate the ability, but it does make better game design sense, I guess, and further distinguishes each aspect of the gameplay. Flight levels are another returning aspect of the game. These are levels where Spyro can move vertically while gliding, like with the power-up, but it lasts for the whole level. Spyro can do his normal flame breath, and if you land on the ground and charge, it defaults to the supercharge. In these levels, a timer is constantly counting down. If it runs out, you have to start over. There are various enemies to kill, objects to light, and/or rings to fly through. Doing each of these adds additional time to complete the level. There are 4 sets of objectives in each level. Completing a set gives you gems, as does completing all of the sets in a single run. There's a certain flow to each level that you can follow, and I did wind up having fun learning what route I should be taking for the most part. It's definitely my least favorite part of the game, but it's by no means bad. There's also a skill point for clearing under a certain time in each of these levels. After completing all of the objectives in one run, if you replay the level, there will be a timer counting upwards instead of downwards, meaning you can't time out anymore. Which is important because each of these levels has a hidden NPC that you can talk to that, of course, have side objective minigame things for orbs, just like the normal levels. A very cool addition as far as I'm concerned. Boss fights are much more traditional in this game, which is probably for the best. They're all arenas where you just go toe-to-toe with a powerful enemy. Can't get any simpler than that. It's a change for the better because these bosses all have interesting mechanics to figure out and are fights that get more complex as you progress through them. They're simply more fun than the very simplistic boss encounters from the first game, and were genuinely a highlight of my Spyro 2 experience and a bit of a challenge to boot. There are unfortunately only a handful of them, so I don't want to show too much of them, but they're cool. I think that the visuals actually hold up surprisingly well. I've never really been particularly fond of the PS1/Nintendo 64 era of visuals. That might just be my bias for pixel art showing, I don't know. But I really like how Spyro 2 looks. The character, enemy, and level designs live comfortably within its visual style and the graphical limitations of the system, still looking good today, rather than pushing up against those limitations and chasing realism, which would absolutely make it look terrible by today's standards. Stylistic art styles simply look better in the long term than realistic ones. If the gameplay still holds up, then bad graphics isn't the biggest deal, but it's still nice for a game to look, well, nice. It's also noteworthy that the facial animations on characters while speaking and emoting were absolutely phenomenal for the time and still look good today. The sound design is still impeccable and makes collecting all of the things an auditory treat. Sparks zipping over to grab gems, the gems from a level being added to your stockpile as you return to the hub, and even the when you get an orb from an NPC. It's an injection of serotonin that my depressed gay body definitely appreciated. The music in the first game was pretty good. Spyro's 2 music is amazing. I caught myself humming along to it pretty regularly. Hurricos was my favorite track, if you're curious. The Reignited version of 1 tread the line between additions that added some character without removing or changing things that made the original so appealing. The biggest change is probably that the dragons, who were all very similar, were given unique designs, and the flight levels felt faster. For the most part, the idea seemed to be to add character where it was otherwise lacking, while preserving everything that could be preserved of the original experience. The Reignited version of 2 seems to be operating under a different, and in my opinion, far worse philosophy. There are a lot of changes everywhere. Not all of these are necessarily bad, but they're near constant, and very few of them actually add to the experience, while a rather significant number actively take away from either the gameplay or comedy of the original. Alora's Reignited design is actually pretty cute. I think I just slightly prefer her original design to the remasters. The problem with Alora comes from her line delivery. Just for comparison, let's get that famous line again.
I'm a fawn, you dork.
I'm a fawn, you dork.
It's all sanitized and made more cutesy. Don't get me wrong, I love cute stuff, but that little bit of bite that she had where she could express that she was actually kind of upset or mocked Hunter or Spyro is just completely gone. It makes her feel like a different, more generic character, and that's a complete shame. Hunter's Reignited design is fine, I guess. For some reason, he literally always has a bow slung across his back, but whatever, decent enough, I guess. His voice lines and animations come off very differently this time. Personality-wise, he's completely flanderized. The only character trait that Reignited Hunter displays is stupidity. Everything he does is either because he's stupid or leads into a joke about his stupidity. In the original, he's slow for sure, but okay. There's a bit where he says he can't chase down Ripto because he lost his running shoes. In the original, this seems like a poorly concocted excuse that no one would believe, but he thinks is a great excuse. In Reignited, it comes off as him legitimately just forgetting his running shoes, despite the fact that he doesn't ever wear shoes in the game. Again, any complexity he had as a character is just gone. The transition between certain animations for NPCs can be awkward. This is most noticeable with Hunter and Alora. What seems to be happening is that the talking animation they have and the idle animation they have don't overwrite the other, but pause the other. So if a talking animation starts when an idle animation is happening, after the talking animation finishes, instead of restarting the idle animation, it will continue from where it was when the talking animation began. This doesn't really affect too much, but it's fucking weird. I really just don't like Ripto's new design. I think he looks lame, and I know he's supposed to be kind of lame, but his original design does look legitimately cool to me. He's a little lizard wizard that's fucking wonderful. His line delivery is also different. It's less raspy, which I think downplays the lizard aspect. Ripto is supposed to be dangerous at the end of the day. It's just that comedic shenanigans stop him until they don't. His old performance leaned into that, the new one does not, and that is lame. There are visual changes, big or small, to pretty much every level. Yes, I mean in addition to the graphical improvements. Glimmer has gems embedded into the environment. This is actually a difference I like, and there are a few more that I don't mind, but some of them change or outright ruin the ideas behind levels. The one that annoyed me the most was Kalice. It's an area with monks, many of whom, well...
How am I supposed to achieve enlightenment if you keep pestering me?
They seem kind of annoyed that you're getting in the way of their meditations and spiritual enlightenment. Seeing such passive-aggressive snippiness from monks is funny. See, the comedy comes from what you expect a monk to be compared to the reality of how they act. This is the level that has the hockey minigame, and it turns out that many of these monks are super into hockey. Again, not something you would normally expect from a monk. It's a funny contradiction, at least I thought it was, and even if you don't think it's funny yourself, you can at least see what they were going for here. Normally I wouldn't feel the need to explain why this comedy works in such detail, except the Reignited version doesn't fucking understand that and completely ruins it. The levels design in Reignited is completely full of hockey stuff everywhere. They're not monks that happen to like hockey, they're hockey monks. It makes it less surprising that they'd be a bit hostile towards Spyro, and moreover, makes it just a matter of course that there would be a hockey minigame instead of it being a fun surprise. This is the problem with the non-gameplay related changes to Spyro Reignited 2. Toys for Bob and or Sanzaru very much didn't understand what made the original clever or funny, which very often means that the changes made take the magic completely out. The experience just feels far more generic and hollow than the original, which was absolutely brimming with clever ideas around every corner. A lot of the NPCs from each level are redesigned or have different voices. Again, some of these changes are innocuous, but others completely change the tone or ruin the joke. I will say that each set of NPCs for a level in the original look identical, with a handful of exceptions, whereas in Reignited they have slight differences, which is neat, but the changes bother me much more. The Fawns in Fracture Hills all sound like Valley Girls in the original, which I thought was genuinely delightful. Like, I just smiled at how bizarre and cute they were, and I fucking love them. In Reignited, they just have Scottish accents, which, like, yeah, that's fitting enough, but it's also very, very different for seemingly no reason. The other change that irritated me the most was to the NPCs in Metropolis. That may just be due to how much I like the level in the original. Again, my problem comes from the voice acting. In the original, they have very stereotypical robotic voices, which I found charming, whereas in Reignited, the voices have much more emotion and just have a bit of robotic undertone to them. This ironically made them much less likable and memorable to me. The last one for NPCs that I want to bring up is from a side objective in Zephyr, based on Romeo and Juliet. In the original, both Romeo and Juliet have masculine sounding voices. This is probably one of two things going on. Either a homosexual romance where one of the guys just happens to go by Juliet, which would be rather progressive for 1999, or a reference to old Shakespearean performance troupes where all of the actors, even those portraying female characters, were men. I like to think that it's both. In Reignited, Juliet has a feminine voice. This change is either removing a homosexual relationship in favor of a heterosexual one, or removing a reference to other adaptations of the source material that inspired this side objective. Either way, that fucking sucks. Oh, and Greta seems to drift in and out of the cutesy voice as she speaks, which is just odd. Also, she and her brother look way too realistic as far as I'm concerned. It is horrifying, and not in the way that they're supposed to be. The intro and outro videos are all changed in some capacity, and all of these changes are for the worse. Almost all of these were originally quick, usually slapsticky jokes involving the NPCs and enemies in the related level. Some of them were cute, or otherwise wholesome too. In Reignited, many of the jokes are changed, and even those bits where the content remains the same are dragged out, which ruins the pacing, removing the comedic punch. You see how those cavemen found a camera in the Skellis Badlands outro? Well, obviously that means in the remaster, we should just give every single one of the small cavemen that you save a camera, because it's way funnier if they all have a camera rather than just one caveman finding one and having shenanigans with it, right? It also definitely makes the outro funnier when you've been seeing the same thing throughout the whole level. Ugh, it's definitely a well-known fact that nothing makes jokes funnier than explanations or repetition. It's nowhere near enough to balance out the bad, and trust me, there's more bad that we still have to get to that is in many ways even worse, but there are some changes and additions for the better in Reignited. You can roll like in the first game, which doesn't serve a mechanical purpose, but does gain points for adorableness. The cool shades cheat code is not a thing in the original games, unfortunately, so my cute purple dragon boy didn't get to look stylish. Yes, I'm still salty about the Pride shades being Switch exclusives, if you were wondering. Dynamic music, where the music changes slightly based on if Spyro is standing still, moving, or charging, is also a neat addition. The biggest gameplay addition that I actually like is that you can control the camera with the right stick. It just feels better, and if you don't like the change, you can set it back to the shoulder buttons from the options menu. There is also an NPC that I'm very glad was changed. Take what I'm about to say with the context that I'm a white woman. In the original, there is a side objective to run through an area while avoiding projectiles from an NPC named Bombo. Bombo is riding a magic carpet, has a turban on his head, has a Middle Eastern accent, is holding a flag with a sword on it, fires explosive projectiles at Spyro in a level that's very Middle East inspired, and he's fucking named Bombo. This shit's problematic to say the very least. They might have been trying to make him a genie, maybe, and it was made before 9/11, which I'm sure is a very ethnocentric frame to look at this from, but even then, it still strikes me as offensive and definitely made me uncomfortable. No shame if that turns you off of the game. It's really the only thing in the whole of the original game that holds me back from a caveat-free, wholehearted recommendation. Thankfully, he only shows up for a rather brief section of a single level, but still, yikes. In the remake, he's very clearly a genie. His name is changed to Bob, and his explosives are green instead of red. Still a bit of an eyebrow raise, but I think they did a good job taking something that was very offensive and changing it into something more palatable. Back to the changes that I take issue with. Early in the story, Elora gives you a magical guidebook to help you get around Avalar. Cleverly enough, this guidebook is displayed as your pause menu, and you flip through pages when looking at what collectibles you've gathered. It's a really cute feature. Reignited just has a normal pause menu. That on its own is an unfortunate loss, but it actually removes content as well. The guidebook is how you access the epilogues that you unlock by acquiring skill points. In Reignited, those epilogues are just completely gone, and instead skill points unlock an art gallery. The art is nice, I guess, but that's a substantial loss of content. The epilogues have some funny and cute stuff in them, and were a wonderful reward for getting those skill points. I was completely shocked to find out that they're just gone. What the fuck? Now, on to gameplay changes. Just like in the first Reignited game, the flight levels are much faster paced. This isn't the worst thing in the world, but it does ruin the flow of some of the routes from the original. The levels weren't originally designed for this movement speed, and it very much shows. Many of the enemies are ruined in one way or another. The living trees from Fracture Hills have an initial attack that is way slower, meaning you can rush them down and burn them before they have a chance to hit you. Whereas in the original, you absolutely needed to avoid the attack before responding in kind. This also affects the tone of the level in Reignited by making those enemies nowhere near as scary to come across, whereas in the original, I got a bit nervous whenever I got near a tree there. When you kill these ice enemies in Crystal Glacier, they used to melt because they're made of ice, but in Reignited, they fly back then burn to ash like many other enemy types. Fine, that's just an aesthetic thing, but it's still fucking annoying. These fire enemies from Skellis Badlands, originally when you killed them, their head would explode, and that explosion would hurt you. It's a nice visual indication of a mechanic. In Reignited, the heads do fall off, but they disappear before the explosion, which makes pretty much no sense and ruins the visual indication for the attack. Many more enemies just look entirely different for no discernible reason, many of them being made much quote-unquote cuter. I think they look fucking terrible. The boss fight mechanics are tweaked, which sucks because in the original, these fights feel absolutely wonderful and act as slightly difficult but fair tests of skill. Crush is made easier because he just moves slower, which means his attacks are easier to avoid and he's vulnerable for longer periods of time. Gulp's missile attack, homes in on Spyro much faster, and requires moving in a way that nothing else in the game asks you to avoid. The final boss is fine, I guess, save the same problem with one of the attacks. There's some minor differences aside from that, like shorter recovery times between attacks in the first phase, but it's not really as big of a deal. If only because there's just so much more of the fight to get through. The biggest gameplay problem is that literally every single side objective and minigame is made less enjoyable in some way. Many of them are made much slower, which means you're probably not going to be hearing too many of these.
Trouble with the trolley, eh?
Many of these changed the camera angle in the original so it could control what information you had on hand. Reignited 2 does this for only a single minigame. Without that, these are just entirely different and far less unique and memorable experiences. Not that that makes them more difficult, because again, everything is just way fucking slower. Some of them are just full-on changed. For example, in Hurricos, there's an objective to put lightning stones back into machines to power something, but there's thieves that appear to steal the stones once you put them in place, with a loud alarm that blares when they've taken one. These thieves do not appear until you put a stone in place, so you have to juggle dealing with the enemies, there's a finite amount of them, so you will eventually get it done, with putting all the stones back. It's simple, but it's fun. In Reignited, the thieves spawn much more quickly. You can generally pop one stone in, then run to the other side of the area, and you'll get to kill one of the thieves. They also take longer to steal the stones, it's a lot less hectic and a lot less fun.
It's also a lot less scary because there's no giant siren.
Fair enough. The ice physics are super slow, which means that the hockey game is an absolute slog to get through as opposed to one of my favorite things in the original. Many minigames had unique dialogue if you failed them. Most of these just don't play when you fail anymore, which is fucking weird. For some of these side objectives, after you've killed the related enemies, they just show up again, which makes it feel like you're not actually accomplishing anything meaningful. These side objectives were one of the most enjoyable aspects of the original, and they're just boring in Reignited. And this isn't at all a gameplay thing, but they absolutely ruined my boy George. Look at what they've done to my boy. He was so fucking endearing before, and his new design is so different. For one thing, he's a much younger snow leopard, his purr isn't as cute, and the plop isn't as satisfying. I'm not joking when I say that this is the change I'm the most upset about. Lily once again captured footage for me. No lost footage this time, thankfully, but she played through the entirety of Reignited 2, which was very kind of her, and seemed to be a rather soul-sucking experience for her. I love and appreciate her very much. Thank you. Do you want to say anything to the people, Lily?
I just want a good Spyro game. Why is Reignited 2 and 3 bad? Why could they just not make it good instead? I don't want to have to pull out my PS1 every time I want to play a good Spyro that is a collectathon.
Are there no good ones on the PS2?
No.
Oh, really?
No.
You were like, played through the rest of the Spyro games.
Every single other Spyro game has, like, big issues.
Good. Thank you for bringing me in.
Dragonfly is like
Except for
garbage. Hero's Tale isn't really a collectathon so much as an action-adventure game. The Legend of Spyro trilogy is fucking weird and different. The Game Boy games are good, I guess.
Yay!
But they're isometric, and sometimes it asks you to make jumps that you literally can't see, and it's also sometimes really hard to see depth.
Okay. Thanks for getting me into this franchise.
You're welcome!
There really does just seem to be a lot of changes just for the sake of changing things, and a lot of them actively make the experience less charming, memorable, and fun. The original Spyro 2 felt brimming with life and character at every turn, while Reignited just feels shallow. It saw what Spyro 2 was at the surface and tried to copy and expand on it without having any degree of understanding about what made the original so fun mechanically and what made the comedy so funny. It's especially jarring after seeing how good of a job the first remaster did of recapturing the magic and fun of the original game. Unless you for some reason absolutely cannot stand to play the original, for the love of Madoka, please avoid the Reignited version of 2. The original version of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage on the PS1 is a game that I had a lot of fun with. It's everything that I think a sequel should be. It still has all of the fun aspects of the first game, and it fixes pretty much all of the problems that were present in the first entry as well. It was an absolute blast to go on another adventure with Spyro and Sparks. Just like the first game, playing through this just made me feel happy. It's good, simple fun, this time with more variety included. I'm super excited to move on to the third game, and am now somewhat concerned for the future of the franchise, having seen how little Reignited seems to understand of the original. But at the very least, Year of the Dragon will probably be a really good time. Hopefully.
Off I go to record footage for the Reignited version of Year of the Dragon.
This has been Kalice. Thanks for watching. You can like the video, subscribe, or share this video around if you enjoyed it and want to. My Patreon exists if you'd like to support me. There's neat bonuses like access to my Discord server and raw recording sessions, so feel free to go look at that. Speaking of, big thanks to all of my current patrons like Ash, Edith, and Lily.
Not me, the other one. Maybe I should change my name.
All of whom are really cool people. Keep loving what you love, and I'll see you next time with something else.